with the Vietnam War, except I like to think my mother had an enormous amount to do with ending Australia's commitment, because in 1972 her eldest boy managed to be conscripted for national service, passed his medical, ready to go, and in the federal election of that year my mother, through various disguises and subterfuge, voted 7 million times for Gough Whitlam, Labour Party elected, and her little boy didn't have to go. So, you know, there you go. We've all got our part to play, haven't we, in the big events on the world stage. It's great to see. Thank you all for coming back on time. It makes quite a difference in the running of the conference. You know, many young Australians have no idea, many young Americans have no idea that Australians served alongside them in Vietnam. Many young Australians have no idea that Indian troops served next to them in the lines at Gallipoli. And in fact, the Indian artillery saved the day for the Australians in those first few days, as Peter Stanley writes about in his book. How little we know about our allies. And so it's fantastic that our next two speakers are going to cover that angle. Nathalie Huynh is a Professor of History at Monash University. We've already heard her in the panel earlier on. And she's also a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, a Commonwealth Scholar at the University of Oxford, and a former Australia Research Council Future Fellow. She's the author of 4 books, including South Vietnamese Soldiers, Memories of the Vietnam War, and others that she'll no doubt talk about. She's held 4 fellowships, including 2 major ARC fellowships. She's been a visiting fellow at that little place called Oxford, and she's also a Harold White Fellowship at the National Library of Australia. Her latest book is called The Refugee Legacy, the Vietnamese Diaspora in the Second Generation. Let's welcome Nathalie to speak to us today.
Thanks very much, Daryl. That's my introduction. And thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to present at this conference. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'll be talking today about female soldiers in South Vietnam. Their histories were until recently largely unknown, despite the fact that some women had 25-year careers in the military. By 1975, 6,000 women were serving in the Women's Armed Forces Corps of South Vietnam, including 600 officers. I'll be using the stories of 2 remarkable women and some facts about the scale of women's service in the South Vietnamese Armed Forces to highlight the ways in which modern historiography has moved ahead of public and much academic understandings of the Vietnam War. The first that I heard about women in the South Vietnamese military was from a friend in Oxford when I was a student there. He was at the time a research fellow, as he had completed a PhD in physics at the University of Edinburgh. He spoke of his pride in his mother, who had served for 16 years in the military and had parachuted out of planes. His name was Huynh Chau, and he later became a professor at Swinburne University and then a Victorian Labour MP between 2018 and 2022. In 2005, when I won an ARC fellowship to work on Vietnamese women, I asked him if it would be possible to interview his mother. She was the first female veteran to be interviewed for my project. So here she is, Nguyen Ngoc Thuy. The photo on the left shows her after a successful parachute jump over the jumping training site at Wu Chi in 1957. Her parachute is deployed in front of her. The photo on the right shows her with her parachute pack over her shoulder before she then returned to the gathering point. She said she weighed about 45 kilograms when the photos were taken. I entitled this paper Pioneers, Female Soldiers in South Vietnam because Nguyen Ngoc Thuy, along with the 9 other women who served with her in the Airborne Division, was a true pioneer. I'm not aware of other military women from any of the Allied forces, whether it was in the United States, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, or Philippines, parachuting out of planes in the mid to late 1950s. It is notable that Thuy was a refugee from the north. She was born in 1936 to a Buddhist family. Her father was arrested by the French in 1947, and the family never saw him again. In 1949, the mother and 6 children moved from Kainan to Haiphong, some 500 kilometres, where they stayed until 1954. Following the end of the Indochina War and partition, the family formed part of the mass migration of 1 million people who left the communist north for the Republican South in 1954-55. This migration was the first of only 2 cross-border mass migrations by the Vietnamese in the 20th century. The second was, of course, the large refugee movement that followed the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. Now, to go back to Thuy, how did she join the military? Oops. I just wanted to go back one. Sorry. It's not doing this. It was working. Okay, thank you. So in 1955, she heard a radio announcement in Saigon that the South Vietnamese government wanted to recruit female army personnel. Her 2 older brothers were already serving in the army. She not only volunteered for military service, but also got 2 female friends and her older sister to do so, making it 4 out of 6 siblings in the army. As Thuy was under 21, she had to ask for her mother's consent. She served in the Airborne Division for 7 years and was in the Armed Forces for 16 years before she was demobilised in 1971. 9 other women also volunteered for parachute training with her. All were Northern refugees. The women needed to complete 6 successful jumps to obtain formal qualifications, while the men needed to do 7 jumps. This is how Thuy explained her choice to volunteer, and I quote, "Many people in the division encouraged me to learn parachuting, and I took the course. There was no compulsion. I liked taking risks. I felt that I had some spare time, and I felt that I could make it. Learning to parachute was very hard. We had to practice jumping from a wooden cage 4 meters high. It was exhausting. On my second jump, when I opened the front of the parachute, the jerk was so strong that I lost my mind for a while." The risks were all too real. As Thuy remembered that one of the other women, Jo, broke her leg upon landing and had to be taken to Phong Hoa General Hospital. Thuy recollects, her wound teemed with maggots. It was horrible. It was highly dangerous, and we had a case of that recently in Australia. Women specialised in folding and repairing parachutes, trained as parachutists, and participated in parachuting exhibitions in the 4 different military zones in South Vietnam. Thuy had 2 brothers in the army, but hid her parachute training from them. Her older brother had forbidden her to join the military. She even had the military jeep drop her away from her home and hid her uniform at their neighbour's house. However, one of her brothers found out and gave her a terrible beating. Brotherly disapproval, however, did not deter Thuy. She completed her training and continued with studies in nursing and sociology. Like the majority of women in the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, Thuy was a non-combatant, working first as a nurse, then as a military social welfare officer. She visited remote battlefields, and her assignments took her to Hue, Saigon, and Quang Tri. In 1968, she was awarded a Medal for Bravery while serving in the Presidential Protection Service. She reached the rank of 2nd Lieutenant and was promoted to Chief of Social Services in the Military Corps before her retirement in 1971. Thuy's narrative reveals a forceful and resilient personality and illustrates a clear sense of agency. She stated, "I heard that in the armed forces you could go here and there to lots of places. I like to travel, so I joined up. I was like a tomboy." Her tasks included bringing injured soldiers back for treatment from remote sites, caring for the wounded in hospitals, and providing support and counselling for soldiers and their families. A strong motivation, however, was the desire to contribute to the war effort so that her family could return to the North. She really missed the North initially. She valued her independence and mobility, although narrative reveals a clear tension between the demands of her career and her family responsibilities. The mobility that she had prized became a burden as it meant spending time away from her children. As she retired in 1971, she was spared internment in post-war re-education camps after 1975, and she also refused to leave her home and moved to the new economic zones. When an armed communist cadre entered her home, she told him to put his gun away, otherwise she would not speak to him. A woman of iron will, she noted, when I say something, it is immutable, like a nail driven into meat. So here are photos of South Vietnamese servicewomen in a variety of roles, from working as frontline surgical nurses in combat field hospitals in 1968, providing care to wounded soldiers, and assisting soldiers' families as social workers or pharmacists. Women served in the armed forces of the state of Vietnam and later the Republic of Vietnam between 1950 and 1975. Some had 25-year careers in the military, including Lord T. who began her career in the Army of the Centre before it was integrated into the National Army of Vietnam in 1952. The Women's Auxiliary Corps consisted of 5 branches: Staff, Medical Corps, Communications, Military Supplies, and Social Work, which were cut down to 2 branches in 1959, namely the Medical Corps and Military Social Work. Members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps had to join one of these 2 branches or demobilise. Their numbers shrank as they had few options for career advancement. In the 1960s, however, the war escalated and the Women's Armed Forces Corps was formed on the 1st of January 1965 around a nucleus of 600 women from the former Women's Auxiliary Corps. The Women's Armed Forces Corps was patterned after the Women's Army Corps in the United States and placed under the command of the Joint General Staff. The shift from the Women's Auxiliary Corps to the Women's Armed Forces Corps signaled a shift from a French-inspired military model to an American one. The training centre, later the Women's Armed Forces Corps School in 1967, was located in Saigon, and the first chief of the Corps was Major Jan Gum, who was a colonel when she retired on the 1st of April 1975, and she was later to die in a communist re-education camp in 1986. The aim was to have 10,000 women serving in the Women's Armed Forces Corps. The school trained 7 classes of female officers. The 8th class was interrupted by the fall of Saigon. Military women received training at different schools such as General Administration, Medical Corps, Finances, Military Supplies, and Military Social Work, and were dispatched to different branches depending on the needs of the Ministry of Defence. A small number received training in the United States, including Army officer training at Fort McClellan in Alabama, civil affairs at Fort Rawdon in Georgia, psychological warfare at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and personnel and general administration at Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana. By April 1975, the Women's Armed Forces Corps consisted of 6,000 women, including 600 officers. Now, some female veterans think that the numbers were closer to 7,000, so they hadn't reached the 10,000 mark that they were aiming for, but the numbers were sort of heading in that direction. Approximately 5,000 women served in the National Police of South Vietnam, and 1 million women served in the People's Self-Defense Forces. So in this respect, the number of women serving in local militias was about the same in both North and South Vietnam. In addition, there were 130,000 women in combat forces defending hamlets and urban neighbourhoods who received 60 hours of course instruction and were referred to as female soldiers without military numbers. Now, a number of these women received medals for outstanding service during the war. So here is a photo of members of the Women's Armed Forces Corps in 1972. So Dorothy there, the lady who is seated in the middle, published a detailed article on the history of the Corps in 2001. So here they are in their light blue uniforms and then marching in 1974 in an event commemorating the Trung sisters. So Bui Ngoc Tui formed part of a major oral history project conducted in Australia between 2005 and 2008. a total of 42 women were interviewed. More female veterans were interviewed in 2013-14 as part of a large oral history project on Vietnamese veterans. These oral histories are preserved in the National Library of Australia. Here are photos of some that are featured in my book. So, Nguyen Ngoc Thuy died in 2014, and her son honoured her for her military service in South Vietnam. I'd now like to talk about another former South Vietnamese female soldier. So this is another Thuy, but one from the younger generation who had a very different career and trajectory. So Thuy served in the Women's Armed Forces Corps from 1969 to 1975. Born in 1951, she had a father in the military and enlisted straight from high school. She was underage, she was only 17, and begged her mother for a week before her mother would agree to sign the form for her. She was a young and idealistic military recruit. She did the non-commissioned officer course, took night classes to do the baccalaureate too, and then took the officer course in 1972. After graduation, she served at the 2nd Corps headquarters in Pleiku during the 1972 offensive. She married in 1973. Her husband was also in the army and was transferred to the 3rd Corps headquarters at Biennial. She gave birth to a son in November 1974. A second lieutenant when the war ended, Thuy remembers the final days of South Vietnam, the many soldiers and civilians who died under enemy shelling, the communist looting of South Vietnamese hospitals, and the forced removal of military amputees. She took her 6-month-old baby with her when she reported for re-education. Her husband was sent to re-education camps for 3 years. Although Thuy's re-education was deferred, she was forced to do hard labour and experienced constant harassment by the post-war authorities. She states, "I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I went from 50 kilograms down to only 35 kilograms. After 3 unsuccessful attempts to escape from Vietnam, she and her son, he was about 8-9 years old, were imprisoned for nearly 2 years. Most of the other prisoners were cross-the-border prisoners. In other words, they had also tried to escape from Vietnam as refugees, like Thuy and her son. Conditions in the prison camp were harsh. She relates, "We worked like animals and ate only 1 bowl of rice. It was wretched." This experience of incarceration and hard labour traumatized mother and son. After her release at the end of 1984, she applied for a divorce and finally escaped Vietnam successfully in 1989. Her son, by then a troubled teenager, chose not to join her during her escape and died after returning to Saigon. She does not even know when he actually died. She spent 4 years in refugee camps in Malaysia before resettling in Australia in 1993, alone, as she says, with no husband, no child. The successive losses that Thuy experienced, army, country, husband, and son, broke her health, and she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder in the form of debilitating headaches and chronic insomnia. In Australia, she is grateful for the comradeship and support offered by other former servicewomen, male veterans, and members of the Vietnamese community who helped her to apply for a service pension. She notes, "I qualified as a Vietnamese Australian veteran, and I marched every year on Anzac Day." Now, what did the choices of servicewomen such as the two Thuys indicate? The first is that of women's shifting roles and responsibilities in the great tension between tradition and modernity that existed in East Asia in its encounter with Western civilization. As a Sinicized culture, Vietnam was imbued with the norms of classical East Asian civilization and concerned with the central question of what to keep of its traditions, cultures, and forms of governance, and what to take on or adapt in terms of modernity and the creation of a modern nation state. In this case, Western technology, culture, and political ideology. As noted by Tobruk and Nguyen Chau, there were 2 major competing political tendencies in Vietnam at the start of the 20th century. These were republicanism and communism. Vietnamese Republicans wanted representative government, the rights of individuals, the rule of law, and separation of powers among government branches. This political vision led to the establishment of the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam. The communists, on the other hand, placed their faith in Marxist-Leninist ideology and strategy and appropriated Republican ideas to broaden their appeal. They established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam. These competing visions for Vietnam existed for decades before the start of the Vietnam War. Women in South Vietnam inherited a martial history and the example of martial female figures from antiquity, as well as more recent female revolutionary heroes. During the short-lived rebellion of the Trung sisters against their Chinese overlords in the 1st century CE, for example, there were female as well as male army leaders. Against this martial tradition was a contrasting Confucian tradition in which women were to abide by the 3 obediences to father, husband, and son, and the 4 virtues. In addition to this, South Vietnam was a new state emerging from colonization and partition. These women were serving in a modern army against the background and geopolitics of the Cold War. Unlike women in the North who were called to mass mobilization by the Communist Party, women in the South were expected to play an ancillary role. In other words, they were there to support the men. Once in the armed forces, they had to negotiate disparate roles as daughters, sisters, wives, and mothers. Vui Ngoc Thuy, for example, expressed clear pride in her 16 years of service. She was a pioneering female soldier and one of the few that not only served in the airborne division but also obtained and maintained parachuting qualifications. Her trajectory in this respect was exceptional. Motherhood, however, shifted her priorities, and she expressed guilt for leaving her children in order to attend to military travel and duties. Now, second, what did these women's choices say about the society in which they lived? Women enlisted for reasons ranging from a love of adventure and sense of patriotism to seeing military service as a career and practical means of earning a living, helping their families materially, and enabling upward mobility. What their accounts do have in common is a strong sense of agency. South Vietnam was a small nation engaged in 20 years of war. The fact that women were in a position to make choices such as volunteering for military service, at times in the face of considerable family opposition, highlights the plurality and relative openness of the society in which they lived. They were not pressured to enlist by the South Vietnamese state. In fact, after death in 1968, a bill was introduced in the South Vietnamese National Assembly to draft women between the ages of 18 and 25, but legislators quickly vetoed that proposal. South Vietnam did not want to conscript women into the military. The assumption was that men would serve on the front line and women would support them. Third, women's narratives are about silenced histories and the importance of archives and recorded memory, about who is remembered and who is forgotten. As noted by Mary Revere, one of the founders of the World Center for Women's Archives in New York in 1942, without documents, no history. Without history, no memory. Without memory, no greatness. Without greatness, no development among women. The post-war Vietnamese state erased the service of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, including the women who served in the army, and whose stories are even less well known than that of the men. And until recently, that omission was reflected in the English language historiography of the Vietnam War. By taking part in an oral history project conducted in Australia, these former service women were acknowledging the trou de mémoire, or memory gap, regarding their history, and acknowledging the importance of that history. Through archives, like Joan Schwartz and Terry Cook, the past is controlled. Certain stories are privileged and others marginalized. Archives wield power over the shape and direction of historical scholarship, collective memory, and national identity, over how we know ourselves as individuals, groups, and societies. The state has a central role to play. In this case, Australia, as a resettlement country, is preserving these histories for a time when Vietnam is finally ready to acknowledge them. Fourth, their stories are part of the Vietnamese turn in Vietnam War historiography, and Steve had already mentioned this, over the last 15 to 20 years, as noted by Edward Miller, Peter Zinnerman, Nguyen Chan, and Tobruk, among others. This Vietnamese turn points to a major shift from dominant US-centered approaches, whether orthodox or revisionist, to one that places the Vietnamese at the center of their own war. This Vietnamese turn recognizes the centrality of Vietnamese experiences, Vietnamese perspectives, Vietnamese language sources, and Vietnamese records and archives. It focuses at last on South Vietnam. The fissures between the Vietnamese state and the post-1975 diaspora mean that diasporic voices and records also need to be considered. Fifth, one of the main roles of oral history is to provide a means of recording people who are otherwise hidden from history, as noted by Robert Perks and Alistair Thompson. By recording their histories, women such as Thuy are providing testimonies of their lived experiences, but also speaking for the dead, military colleagues who were executed after the war or who died in post-war re-education camps, during the refugee journey and after resettlement. Their stories note the complexity of factors that generate war, the multiple actors involved, and that much remains to be done in terms of acknowledging non-privileged histories of the war. The sixth point, as illustrated by the story of the second Thuy, is Australian recognition of the service of Vietnamese veterans. Australia accepted few Vietnamese refugees after the fall of Saigon. Only 539 Vietnamese were admitted in 1975-76. As the war drew to a close in 1975, the Whitlam Labor government refused to permit the evacuation of Vietnamese staff of the Australian embassy in Saigon, despite repeated requests from Jeffrey Price, the last Australian ambassador to South Vietnam. The archival record reveals that in 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam personally rejected Vietnamese refugee applications that had already been approved by his foreign minister, John Willisey. And my father's name is actually in one of those documents, but I mean, I've written about this elsewhere. Although the Fraser Liberal Country Party coalition government that came to power in 1975 sympathised with Vietnamese refugees on a political level, refugee admittance numbers remained modest until the arrival of the first Vietnamese boats on Australia's northern shores in 1976. Australia took part in the United Nations Conference in 1979, in which the international community pledged to increase resettlement offers to 260,000. Under Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, Australia responded generously to the Indochinese crisis of 1978-1982 by accepting the largest number of refugees per head of population of all countries. Proportionately, Australia resettled twice as many Indochinese refugees as the United States. The Fraser government's Repatriation Acts Amendment Act No. 2, 1979 came into effect in 1980 and extended, for the first time, the service pension entitlement to members of the forces of an allied country. It was largely aimed at World War II veterans, but also included veterans of later wars, including the Korean War and the Vietnam War. There were problematic issues such as the cut-off date of 11th January 1973, and most of all controversies under the Hawke Labor government, in which a proposal was made under the Veterans Entitlement Bill 1985 to exclude Allied veterans of the Vietnam War. This was vigorously disputed in the Senate, however, and again I've written about this, and this proposal was removed. For Vietnamese veterans such as Thuy, this recognition means a great deal. She feels supported by fellow veterans and by Australia. By extending the service pension eligibility to these veterans, Australia has enabled them to embrace their previous histories and identities as South Vietnamese ex-service personnel and adopt new identities as veterans whose service is recognised by Australia. Vietnamese veterans can therefore assert their pride in being Vietnamese and having served South Vietnam, while affirming their sense of belonging to a new homeland, Australia. So to sum up, the women's stories illuminate large issues in Vietnam War historiography. Three key points are: their experiences highlight the plurality of South Vietnamese society. Women volunteered to serve for a variety of reasons, They had a strong sense of agency since they were not pressured by the state, and in some cases enlisted in the face of strong opposition. The fact that South Vietnamese women trained as parachutists and jumped out of planes in the mid to late 1950s, at a time when no woman in the Allied forces did so, made them true pioneers. Second, their stories not only highlight previously silenced histories of South Vietnam, its people and its armed forces, but also symbolize the new Vietnamese turn in Vietnam War historiography that takes notes of Vietnamese voices and Vietnamese archives, and at last positions the Vietnamese at the center of their own war. Lastly, Australian acknowledgement of South Vietnamese military service reflects the recognition of and respect accorded to a former ally. South Vietnamese personnel who survived post-war internment, re-education and the refugee experience had the opportunity to have their military service formally recognised by Australia. Their stories show that this recognition makes an important contribution to the transition of veterans and their families to a sense of belonging in Australia and new identities as Vietnamese Australians. Thank you.
Okay, fun fact, hands up those people, not you, those people in the room who knew that Vietnam had women parachutists. Well, there you go, see, come on, oh no, no, not you. Well, how about that? We have all learned something amazing already today. Natalie does have time for some questions, so we'll be happy to take those. Yes.
Did women serve in the front line of the Republic of Vietnam's army? I mean, were they in...
Were they combat?
Yeah, in combat, or were they like Americans there somewhere but not saying nothing?
No, well, not the ones in the Women's Armed Forces Corps. They had non-combat roles.
Right.
But if you're serving as a nurse on the front line and serving in combat hospitals, I mean, the missiles did fall. So, it was pretty dangerous stuff. But I did mention the 130,000 women who did serve, in a combat capacity in terms of defending local villages. And there's some pretty dramatic stories of those. I mean, some of those did win medals for bravery during the war. And this included taking up arms when their husbands were shot dead next to them. So there were women, but they were very much a minority. The women who served in the Women's Armed Forces Corps were served in a support.
Could you just summarise what the training was? A static line, free fall, knife jumps, water jumps, and the height?
Oh, I don't know. Those are very technical questions. Actually, the only thing she did say that they needed fewer jumps than men. To gain their qualification, 6 jumps were enough instead of 7 jumps for the men. I don't know under what conditions they jump, but I mean it's really dangerous stuff. And as she said, one of her fellow, one of the other women, not the same name, his name was Chau. She had a really nasty leg injury. She broke her leg on that. Yeah.
Thank you, yes.
Both the women you described to us went through the re-education camps.
No, not the first one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Where would you go to read about the experience of people that went through that re-education process? What would be a reliable source to read about that?
I've written a fair bit in my book, which is...
Apparently you're a side colleague over the corner. Well, it will be when you get there.
It's called South Vietnamese Soldiers, Memories of the Vietnam War and After, and it includes the experiences of male and female personnel in re-education camps after the war.
Yes, Bruce.
Natalie, is there a cultural gender dimension in the story that you're telling us? My casual experience with working with the Vietnamese community is that, the aspirations that families have for their children is well known. But my casual observation is that Vietnamese women tend to be reasonably assertive, reasonably well organised, and are really, in many cases, a driving force of local communities. Is that something that you would relate to, or is that is it unusual, do you think?
No, I mean, I think, well, the Vietnamese are called generals of the interior. Vietnamese women are called generals of the interior.
Like we have the legal opposition.
So the society is nominally patriarchal, like most East Asian societies, but there's a strong, naturally,
The Trung sisters.
Yes.
And
So there's that strong tradition. I mean, Vietnam borrowed so much from China, but it never practiced foot binding, for example. And the legal codes in Vietnam were much more open towards women than the Chinese codes of the Ming and Qing dynasties. So, so it doesn't surprise me that maybe outwardly Vietnamese women were quiet. Inside the house was something different. They were pretty much in charge. They were depending on the families. But what was really interesting, in the case of the stories of female veterans, they had very different reasons for enlisting. I mean, some of them, like the second Twee, very young, very idealistic, 17-year-old kid. She was inspired by a very attractive female recruitment officer. She wanted to serve her country. So it's a really sad account because you see this very hopeful young woman, going through training to serve her country, and then of course she witnessed terrible things, and she witnessed especially the end of South Vietnam, and that she was, forced to do hard labour. She had a complete breakdown. What people tend to forget, it wasn't just the veterans who were sent to re-education camps. If you tried to escape from Vietnam with your family and you were caught, you were often sent to prison as well with your children. And in her case, she actually went to prison for 2 years. That's really damaging, if you imagine, for a young child. So, I mean, her story is really a trauma story. She's suffering from PTSD. And she's a survivor. I mean, there's so many others who didn't survive that experience, like the former chief of the Women's Armed Forces Corps. There were women who were executed for plotting against the regime after the war, and others who obviously died during the crossing, who tried to escape from Vietnam.
Thank you. One last question.
Nathalie, thanks for that talk. That was terrific. Vo Chi Sao was a heroine of the communists. Was she also? It could be that she would also be a heroine of South Vietnamese women. Would that be the case?
I don't know. I think women were inspired to a certain level by the heroism of women from the past. I don't know how the Trung sisters always comes up. As to others, I haven't necessarily heard of them from the women themselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking that she was an anti-French.
A lot of the women came from that anti-French background.
Yeah.
A lot of the people who joined the Viet Minh
Yeah.
believed that the Viet Minh were genuinely nationalists. So they were strongly anti-French. And then when they realized that the Viet Minh were communists, they then transferred their allegiance to the Republic of Vietnam.
Nathalie, we've learned today about Indians being a Gallipoli, but even more importantly, we've learned about the tremendous role and sacrifice that Vietnamese women have made. I love the way you just said, she was, a woman parachutist. She had 4 children during that time, as one does. Nathalie, could I just present this to you and thank you very much indeed for coming and